What's happening, fandoms? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, we react to music videos and shows. Today, we're going back to our series of breakdowns from the new Rockstars of The Last of Us. This is for episode 8. And man, episode 8 was a killer. So I am really looking forward to what we get pointed out. If you're not familiar with new Rockstars, they do everything that the internet is interested in right now. That's basically their tagline. I left out a swear word. They do everything. All of the coolest IP, Star Wars, Marvel, anything that's even remotely cool, they break it down and check it out. So go check them out. And now let's dive into episode 8.
Welcome back to New Rockstars. I'm Eric Voss, and this is a breakdown of The Last of Us episode 8. We're at Todd's Steakhouse. Maybe stick to the salad bar. Let's break this down scene by scene for the details you might have missed, the references to the game, the changes from the game, and how chilling this episode truly is. Be sure to subscribe to our new channel, The Deep Dive, where next week I'm going to be doing a live breakdown of the finale episode on Sunday night. And of course, you can support us by grabbing some merch at nerdriot.shop, like this Last of Us inspired shirt. And hey, if you Sunday night HBO watchers plan to move on to the final season of Succession after this, and you might like to see me break down those episodes, we'd really appreciate it if you let us know by liking or replying to the pinned comment below. Okay, we open on the blizzardy lakeside resort of Silver Lake, where David reads Revelation 21 from the New Testament.
And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away.
Revelation 21 is the penultimate chapter to the Bible, preceding Revelation 22, as this is the penultimate episode of the season. In this section of Revelation, the author, John, describes the resolution to the war between good and evil when both heaven and earth were remade and God wipes away all suffering. This is what David says drew him to Christianity during the apocalypse, where the end of the world has already happened, and these verses in Revelation describe the salvation that comes after those dark times, foretelling that the world must be destroyed so that a new heaven and new earth can be one. Of course, we later learn that this is just some convenient Bible verses that suits the way David really looks at the world. David's supposed Christianity is not so pronounced in the game. He's not a preacher that we know of, but he does tell Ellie that he believes all things happen for a reason, and the game does have that same banner of when we are in need, he shall provide. We don't yet know here that David is a cannibal. For all we know, these could just be grieving Christians, so it makes it harder to judge the character of David in the first half of the episode, just as it is in the game when, as Ellie, you initially team up with David. Outside the steakhouse, you can see claw marks on the wooden planks, some bears sniffing the meat inside, perhaps. The freezing temperature reflects another bit of religious poetry, Dante's Inferno, in which the bottom circle of hell is frozen, for it is the furthest away from God's warmth. And David uses the end of the passage to console the mother and daughter of the raider that Joel killed back on the campus.
And God will wipe away all tears from their eyes, for there will be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither will there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away.
So David's interpretation for them is that suffering is of the mortal earth, but it's not exactly consoling for those of us still living on this earth. Hannah asks when they can bury her dad, and David checks in with James before responding,
"The ground is too cold to dig. We'll bury your father in the spring."
Yeah, I don't think that's the only reason why. David later says only a few people know that they've resorted to cannibalism, and I think David wants to keep a few spare ribs on the menu. David's lieutenant, James, is played by Troy Baker, who played Joel in the games and hosts the amazing HBO Last of Us podcast with Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann. Both Troy Baker and Ellie game actress Ashley Johnson have roles on this show. Johnson will appear next episode as Anna, Ellie's mother, while Merle Dandridge is the one actor on the show who also played her character Marlene in the games. David asks James how much they have left, and after a pause, he clarifies venison, elk, and rabbit, indicating that they've already probably begun mixing human meat into the food supply. David's really asking for a countdown of how long they have before they have to start killing current residents and letting everyone know that this is what they've been doing. If David acts like he's the second coming of Jesus, James is the analog of the doubting Thomas, who must see to believe. Though interestingly, it's Ellie's wrist scarring that opens his eyes, and Joel with the stab wound in his side, the two of them together representing the great redeemer of this episode. This episode adapts the part of the game where you play as Ellie at the lakeside resort location as Joel is recovering from his injury, and it presents a whole new challenge playing as a character who hasn't had the same experience as the other protagonist. Ellie uses a bow and arrow in the game instead of Tommy's rifle with the scope here, and we don't really get to know David quite as well. And they removed a section from the game where Ellie and David team up to escape a horde of infected. Ellie first spots a white rabbit. Back in episode 6, I pointed out this show drawing a comparison between the white rabbit that Ellie takes and Ellie herself, a motif continued in episode 7 with the white rabbit in the mall photo booth. And now it definitely seems intentional. This this white rabbit ends up getting away, its innocent white fur disappearing in the snow as Ellie escapes this episode in the white blizzard. You can also draw a connection
Ellie
to
gets
Alice in
away.
Wonderland. Alice chases a white rabbit through the portal into another world, as Ellie, you could argue, does here, with David being the grinning Cheshire cat, though that cat isn't even the biggest threat. The Queen of Hearts is, and in the show, our Queen of Hearts is, actually we'll get to that in spoiler corner. As you do in the game, Ellie has to follow the blood trail from the deer, where that wounded deer eventually collapses, and she finds David and James there. The conversation is almost word for word, except Ellie holds him up with a gun instead of a bow and arrow.
Any sudden moves, I put one right between your eyes. Ditto for Buddy Boy.
And like Ellie in the game,
Buddy
Ellie ends up
Boy.
being unable to hide her desperation.
What do you need? We have boots.
Medicine?
Now, Ellie needs penicillin, which is an antibiotic that ironically is derived from fungus, which the opening scene of the series actually foreshadowed.
Where do we get penicillin from?
Fungus.
By revealing she needs medicine, Ellie outs herself for having some wounded partner, so that from here forward, David definitely knows she is the girl his group is looking for. Like, notice he asks,
That's your dad's gun? You the one that's sick? That's why you're out here on your own?
Ellie smartly unloads both their rifles, showing that she has learned from Joel from back in episode 3, when he stowed his gun under the floorboards. It's not always worth it to carry these bulky guns with you. At the end of the day, it's sometimes better to disable these other guns, the ones that you can't carry, so that they can't end up being used against you. While Ellie points the rifle at them, interesting to see her struggle with the weight of the gun, which apparently Bella Ramsey really did when they were shooting this. Those things are heavy for kids. Just another tell for David that she's still getting used to this gun and it belongs really to someone else. David says that he's a preacher who found his calling after the world ended.
Before that, I was a teacher. Math. Taught kids about your age.
Now, saying he's a teacher is similar to the moment in Saving Private Ryan when Captain Miller finally reveals that before joining the Army, he was a high school English teacher. In fact, that movie came out in 1998. For all we know, David just saw that movie and saw how quickly it won over the trust of his group and thought, you know what, I might use that. It's probably likely that David isn't telling the truth because later he says,
I've always had a violent heart, and I struggled with it for a long time, but then the world ended and I was shown the truth.
and so David's backstory is left a mystery and it probably wasn't good. He's kind of like Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight, or to borrow from another survivalist
never
series,
thought that he might be
Lost, like Ben
lying.
Linus when he claims to be Henry Gale, when for him the shoe was on the other foot and he was locked in a kitchen in season 2. We learn more and more frightening things about David as this episode goes. But here David says,
But when the Pittsburgh QZ fell in 17, Fireflies and Fedra, I left with a few others, and that's how I ended up with our flock.
so there's a good chance he was in Pittsburgh, which in the show they bypass, but in the game, that is where the Henry and Sam events take place. David also
Right.
calls his group his flock, a common preacher metaphor, which is a bit ironic since its actor is Scott Shepard, who is in a bunch of things, including True Detective Season 3. I really love this conversation because in the game, all you really get is David saying, everything happens for a reason, and then segueing into him saying she and Joel were the ones they were looking for. But now, Ellie and we are lured into this false sense of security just by David's affable charm. David tells James to give her the medicine and lets her escape. Now, why does he do this? This thing a lot of game players were speculating about, and the actor who played David in the games, Nolan North, whom Tommy and I interviewed on New Rockstars a few years back, Nolan North said that David's interest in Ellie, especially when he puts his hand on hers later, wasn't necessarily in the game overtly sexual, but that idea does start to creep into David's mind as he considers himself a protector growing a community.
He clearly likes to get his way. You know, when you're put in that situation, maybe the population is, you know, his group, and there's not as many women, and he wants to repopulate his area. And here's somebody who's clearly a survivor.
And
Yeah,
by
it's
the way,
still
look at
super
baby Greg
creepy.
Miller there. I love what Greg, Tim, Colin, and Nick and the rest have built with Kind of Funny. They got an amazing team over there. But unlike the games, we spend a lot of time with David's community, and we witness their suspicions that they are eating human flesh.
What is it?
Venison.
Venison.
It's just so creepy that in their food prep process, the meat has to come from another room. And yes, in this case, this meat is probably this woman's husband, whom Joel killed and David refused to bury. David returns with a deer framed perfectly under the "he shall provide" banner, but there's no joy in the room since they've all heard now that David let Ellie get away. And Hannah even says that David should have killed them both, and David hits her, but then helps her back up. Yes, this guy definitely came from a violent past, and he sits at their table in the seat of the guy they're probably now eating. And they add injury to it by saying grace, saying,
Teach us to know by whom we're fed. Bless us with Christ, the living bread.
yeah, Christ the living bread. Definitely a parallel here with Jesus at the Last Supper saying, take this all of you and eat it. This is my body.
Ugh.
This group perversely distorting that to justify cannibalism. While the residents gobble down their probably man stew, the guy who brought in the meat is a bit slower to put a chunk of it in his mouth because he's the one who chopped the guy up.
He
David leads a honey
knows
party to
what
the
it
neighborhood and
is.
orders to leave Ellie alive.
If we leave her out here, she'll die.
Yeah, maybe that's God's will.
Yeah. Doesn't like being told what God's will is.
Yeah, David is threatened by James interpreting what God's will is because David's gatekeeping of God's will is the bedrock of his power. Ellie lures them off on horseback, which in the game is way longer and a way more intense chase through the cabins, but it ends the same way, the horse sadly getting shot and Ellie falling off it. But rather than having some time to hide in the cabins and look through a bunch of drawers, she gets taken right away, spared by David. In the game, Ellie wakes up in the cage to find a human body already getting butchered. Here we get an extra scene where David is a level of menacing without being revealed as a fully fledged cannibal yet. The fact that the cage is here in this room is horrifying. It means that past prisoners had to watch as the others were being butchered in front of them, knowing that they would be next. Meanwhile, back in the house, Joel's torture scene goes down pretty much exactly as it does in the game, but now we see how he trapped the two guys in David's group, using a wounded survivor as a trap, just as he knew this tactic was a trap when they first drove into KC, since he had done that before. This is the darkest we have seen Joel since he beat the guardian outside the Boston QZ, and Pedro Pascal plays it not with evil in his eyes, but with just exhaustion. As in the game, he puts the bloody knife in the guy's mouth to point to the map, some brutal pragmatism because he essentially made a marker. Kind of like Dolores Umbridge torturing Harry Potter by making him write lines with his own blood. But just as in the game cutscene, it ends with,
It's okay.
No.
I believe him.
No.
That's all right. I believe him.
No, wait!
now the game actually shows the pipe hitting the head, thankfully not here, because we are not in Joel's perspective, we are in his victim's perspective. So not until David brings the plate of food does Ellie notice the ear on the ground. She refuses to eat the food, whereas in the game, Ellie trusts that it's deer meat, and she eats some of it before she kicks the plate. But this script in this scene gives David a lot more of a rationale. He says that this was the last resort to keep his people from starving, and not to defend cannibalism in really any context, but I do recommend you read up on the story of the Uruguayan rugby team on Flight 571 in 1972. These were the events that inspired the movie Alive, when these group of survivors crashed in the Andes Mountains and they had to resort to cannibalism to survive. It's an insane story, but these guys had to rationalize cannibalism as just a group of friends knowing they wouldn't survive, hoping that their bodies would be used to keep their friends going. Perhaps a more apt historical comparison would be the Donner Party of 1846, 1847, a group of pioneers who got stuck in the freezing cold temperatures of the California Sierra Nevadas, and some of whom had to resort to cannibalism. Of course, this is a whole other thing than what we see here. I mean, we know there are deer and rabbit in those woods if they just look hard enough, and it's never, ever, ever, ever justified to murder someone and Jeffrey Dahmer their corpse. But David has an even wilder rationale. He says he was shown the truth not by God, but by cordyceps.
Yeah,
What does
that's
cordyceps
horrific.
do? Is it evil? No. It's fruitful. It multiplies. It feeds and protects its children. And it secures its future with violence if it must. It loves.
So David really exposes himself as a false preacher, or at least a guy who distorts the tenets of Christianity to suit his own perverse worldview. He worships an amoral natural force, saying, quote, "It's fruitful, it multiplies," which is a reference to Genesis 35:11. This episode begins with Revelation and ends with Genesis. In Genesis, God said to Jacob, renaming him Israel, "Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body." Another hint at David's true Jeffrey Epsteinian goal to seek mates to produce as many offspring as possible.
Very
David
gross.
ends by saying cordyceps loves, a recurring message from Mason and Druckmann, the destructive power of love, and how cordyceps, with its kissy oral transmissions, shows how love can be toxic. David places his hand on the bars.
We'd make this place perfect.
Yeah, so gross.
Spread out. And we do whatever we needed for our people.
Yeah, he says grow, spread out, like he's describing the fungal outgrowth in the opening credits. Ellie seems to engage with him for a second, but breaks his finger and tries to steal the keys. This is how the scene ends in the game, both times with David saying,
How did you put it? Tiny little pieces?
Yeah, both of the voice actor and the live action actor, I've seen interviews with both of them now about these scenes and David's intentions, and in both cases they felt like these things were not overtly sexual and they were not pedophilic, and yet the actress Bella Ramsey and the voice actress Ashley Johnson both felt extremely the other way. So it's really a male versus female perspective on this kind of gross attention. And I would tend to side more on the female side, because these things seem very, very gross and super, super inappropriate.
How did you put it? Tiny pieces.
Now, instead of Ellie seeing the corpse being butchered in the game, the first glimpse of the corpses here is left for Joel. A few bodies suspended from above is a lot like the bodies that Joel runs past in the games later. It's just really freaky to pass these. Ellie escapes the same way, by biting David and claiming to be infected, showing them her arm, and using that hesitation to get James in the neck. But one interesting change here is that the fire in the restaurant is caused by Ellie throwing a log. In the game, a lantern gets knocked over, so here it becomes a hell of Ellie's own making, and David maniacally decides not to leave. Fighting David in the game is not easy. You have to sneak up behind him and be careful not to step on broken plates because David will hear you and turn around. And you gotta stab him 3 times, but after the second stab, David stops just casually around calling your name and begins to crouch and sneak around himself. And they pay homage to that here in the way that Ellie sneaks up behind David and makes a mistake. Ellie yells in rage before she stabs him, alerting David to turn around and throw her. She can't help herself because David has just creepily said he's gonna be her dad and, quote, teach her. To me, this is David admitting his story about being a teacher was a lie. His version of teaching was probably some kind of horrible abuse or violence, because he finally reveals while on top of her, the fighting is the part he likes the most. Gross. The ambiguity that was there in the game is not ambiguous here. David pins her saying,
There's no fear in love.
this is the ultimate bullshit that proves David has never actually loved anyone, because nothing is scarier than love. As Joel and Ellie know, to truly love something is to feel vulnerable, to feel that you will lose that person or that something awful might happen to them. So Ellie doesn't just kill David, she absolutely destroys him and everything he represents. And I'm so grateful this butchery goes down exactly as it does in the game, and I'm blown away with the intensity that Bella Ramsey brings. You can hear her voice give out on that last scream. Now in the game, Joel pulls Ellie off of David, but this show lets Ellie finish until she feels complete, and Joel catches her outside.
Okay, baby girl. I got you.
Baby girl.
I got you.
He calls her baby girl, the first time Joel allows himself to verbally relate
And
to
his
Ellie.
watch is right there.
And notice in the shot of Joel hugging Ellie, his broken watch from Sarah, the one frozen in time from the moment of Sarah's death, is framed front and center. Joel has now fully mapped his love for Sarah onto his love for his new daughter, Ellie. Ellie has renewed Joel's purpose of guardianship. And Joel and Ellie end this episode not relieved, but afraid, because despite what David said, there is fear in love. That fear is what makes it so rewarding when the love is given back to you, because you are just 2 panicked souls clutching each other in the cold, giving each other permission to feel afraid. So you know what? Anyone who says there's no fear in love. Okay. Let's quickly check into Spoiler Corner.
Let's go, Eric.
Folks, and I mentioned the Alice in Wonderland parallel before. Despite how evil David clearly is, I think the ultimate Queen of Hearts of this Wonderland is Marlene. Marlene is the Firefly leader who manipulated Joel and Ellie to get to the St. Mary's Hospital to surgically sacrifice Ellie for a cure. We'll see how that goes down in next week's finale.
Yeah, we
remember to
will.
subscribe to our new channel, The Deep Dive, and please let us know in the comments below if your Sunday night viewing schedule is going to continue with Succession, because I would really love to break that down, but if not enough people are watching it on this channel, we might just talk about it in different ways. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Ep8, follow New Rockstars, and subscribe to New Rockstars for more analysis of everything you love. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Yeah, that was an intense episode for Ellie and for all of us, really. I think my favorite, but still super gross me out parts of this breakdown were the biblical and scripture references, because what a way to manipulate people using something they're familiar with, but something that David obviously didn't truly believe. It's just a convenient tool to control and manipulate people. And I don't want to draw too much correlation to real religion and this cultism, but it's just scary how people will believe things when they are couched in a religious context and follow people they should not follow, just simply in the name of the Lord or religion or scripture. And there were absolutely a lot of references to biblical and scripture topics, and Eric called them all out, and it is scary how apt those comparisons are to this show and to the real world in some cases. So yeah, I think that episode 8 was very likely one of my favorite episodes of the season, because it recreated a piece of the game that was really groundbreaking and pivotal, where we switched from having Joel be the main character and the perspective of the player to Joel is incapacitated and now Ellie is the main character, which was really interesting and absolutely different from most games. You don't generally switch protagonists in the middle. So I really enjoyed the way they portrayed this. It was a little bit different, like Eric said, but I think that nothing that we lost hurt the narrative. And I just like just about everything else they've done with the HBO version, the choices they've made are narratively pleasing, and they fit very well into this style of storytelling. And I don't think the things we lost were actually losses. I think we gained far more than we lost. So I really do appreciate the attention to detail that they've had, and how careful they are with the main concepts and story beats along this journey. So, all right, I think that's enough of me going on about this. We'll leave it there. Once again, if you're not already a fan of the new Rockstars, please go check them out. They do amazing work and produce tons and tons of content, more than just these breakdowns. Go check out what they do and give them a follow. And we really appreciate all the comments and support you guys have for us as we move along in our shows, and liking the videos and subscribing and so on. And we appreciate it very, very much. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next video.